Devil's Song, written by Jason Patchwork. Prologue. Sacrifices had to be made, he thought, but in the end it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was that he'd finally done it. Finally, after all these years of searching, all the planning, he'd found something that could bring the song to life. The song he'd heard in his head, the song he'd found in the book. He could make the voices stop. He wasn't sure when it had all started. Sometime after she died, of course. But he wasn't sure when. All he knew was they'd led him eventually to the book, and the book had led him to the song. Everyone thought he was crazy when he talked about it, so he stopped talking. Instead, he worked. He worked, and he taught. But none of that mattered now. It was over. He'd done it. The voices had stopped, if only for now. And the song wasn't just in his head anymore. Now it was real. He smiled, looking down at the girl who would make his dreams come true. The fragile doll that would save him from his nightmare. He still remembered the day she'd shown up at his door, hand in hand with her mother. She was beautiful, like a church painting of an angel, but of course, her mother was lovely too. Or she had been before. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. He didn't care about beauty, and the only woman he'd ever found beautiful was gone. And in her place were the voices and the song. But this little thing, this angel, this broken doll, she was the one after all these years of searching and teaching, all the days and nights alone desperately hunting for an answer he never found. It was all right here in his hands. He'd be free and he'd have his answers. The girl learned fast. She was a natural talent, the fastest and sharpest he'd ever seen. In less than a year, and at barely 10 years old, she was one of the best pianists he'd ever heard. And so, after only a few months, he began to teach her the song. The one he'd found in the book, the one he'd heard in his mind. Just a little bit at a time, because she had to be ready, and it had to be perfect. He had to be sure she was the one, and he had to make her ready. Not just to play the music, but to be the vessel for the thing when it came through. That was why her mother had to die, and that was why he had to prepare her like he did. She had to be broken before she could play the song. She had to be sad. She had to feel it before it could be real. Then the voices told him it was time. So he prepared. He took extra time to shower and make sure he was clean before they started. Then he cleaned the house too, top to bottom. That alone was no easy task, given how large the old house was, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was finally ready. He shook his head, clearing away the thoughts before they drifted into memories, as was likely to happen. None of it mattered. She was here now, and he stood, silent, as he listened to her play. His song, their song. The sound of it drifted up from the old piano and filled the house. The girl's tiny fingers flew over the keys with what seemed like supernatural skill and speed. Her long hair fell over her face as her fingers moved, hiding her pained expression. He closed his eyes and let the sound of it wash over him as she hit the next crescendo. She was nearing the end of the song now. He could feel it. The voices could feel it too. They were excited, and he thought he could hear something whispering. Something just beyond his ability to understand over the sound of the broken angel and her song. "It's time," he whispered to himself and the voices. He looked around the dim, candle-lit room. He could taste the incense in the air, the kind the book told him to buy. Everything had to be just right. It all had to be perfect, according to the book and to the voices. The music began to rise as the song neared its finale, and he found himself grinning almost painfully. Louder and louder, the piano seemed to grow in volume as she played, until the sound grew to an almost exhausting and deafening level. As though the music came from the speakers of a professional sound system in a music hall. Of course, that wasn't possible. Suddenly, he felt uncomfortable. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be that loud. It couldn't be. The piano roared, growing ever louder, ever more intense. The sound wasn't right anymore. The whole thing, it was wrong. The haunting melody, filled with its pain and misery, filled with its fear, worked its way into his head. He brought his hands up to his ears, trying to block it out. The music wouldn't be stopped now, growing louder still inside his mind. His eyes began to blur as he tried to focus on Ivy. The girl's eyes rolled back in her head, and she played on as if possessed. Her hands moved even faster now, moving with a speed and grace that couldn't be human anymore. She was a specter, a demon dressed as a little girl. He tried to scream, tried to call out for her to stop, but all that came out was a low, painful moan. He dropped to his knees as his vision began to fade. The sound grew, filling the house, filling his mind until all that existed was the music. Then everything fell away, and all he could see was the girl and the piano. But she wasn't a little girl anymore, wasn't his broken doll. Her eyes snapped forward and stared into him, black eyes. Whatever it was playing the piano, it was here now, and it wasn't going to leave. The sound continued to grow, permeating every inch of the old house, and he finally understood. He'd been used. All this time, the voices, the music, all of it had been a trap. They'd lied to him. There were no answers. There was nothing here except pain. He would never be free now. He opened a door, and whatever had come through, it would never let him go. He'd given it what it needed to get out, and now that it was here, now that he'd given it the key, it wasn't going to leave. As his eyes closed and he felt himself falling down into somewhere dark, colorless, and cold, he understood. He'd taken an angel, broken her, and made her play a devil's song. And now that he'd opened the door, he would never be able to close it again.